The Heiress and the Foreman's son, the forbidden love that changed their destinies. She was only 17 when she fell in love with the ranch foreman's son. A forbidden love that cost them everything. He was thrown out. She was sent away. 7 years later, she returned, expecting to find the humble boy from before. But now he owns the neighboring lands and has the power to destroy everything her family built. Comment where you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe, because the love that pride tried to erase came back like wildfire. Caroline was 17 when she realized that looking at Wade Mercer wasn't the same anymore. He'd always been there since childhood, the foreman's son, the boy who helped his father in the corrals, who fixed fences, who knew every corner of Thornfield Ranch better than any heir ever would. The property sat on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, in the heart of cattle country. Fertile lands, century-old tradition, and the Thornfield name carved into every fence post, every contract, every conversation in town. She grew up seeing Wade from a distance, but that summer something changed. Maybe it was the way he smiled when she stumbled in the barn, or how he held her arm, firm yet gentle. Or maybe it was just fate, saying that there, in that place where everything should have been predictable, something unexpected was about to happen. "Careful, Miss Caroline," he said with that respectful tone he used with all the Thornfields. She wanted to respond, but her voice simply wouldn't come. Her heart did what words couldn't, but his gaze wasn't respectful. It was curious, intense. And she felt it. Felt her heart race in a way she'd never felt before. In the following days, Caroline started finding excuses to be wherever Wade was. She'd bring water to the ranch hands, pretend she needed to check on the horses, fake interest in the harvests. And he noticed. Of course he noticed. At first, Wade kept his distance. He knew his place. Knew that looking at the boss's daughter meant crossing a line that couldn't be crossed. But Caroline didn't make it easy. She smiled, started conversations, asked about his life, about the dreams he kept locked inside his chest. And slowly, the barrier between them began to crumble, until one rainy afternoon, when everyone took shelter in the main house, the two of them ended up alone in the barn. Rain pounded on the tin roof with force. The smell of wet earth came through the cracks. And there, among hay bales and old tools, Caroline and Wade talked like they'd never talked before. "You're gonna leave someday, aren't you?" he asked, fidgeting with a rope between his fingers. "I'm going to study in New York," she answered, but her voice came out low, as if she didn't want to accept it. "My father's already decided, and I'll stay here," he said, "doing what my father does, what my grandfather did." She looked at him, really looked, and saw something nobody else saw a man who deserved more than life had given him. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Life's not fair, Caroline." It was the first time he called her without the miss. And it was in that moment that everything changed for good. The sound of rain was the only noise between them, and even that seemed too little compared to what the silence was saying. Wade moved closer slowly, like someone afraid of breaking something precious. And Caroline didn't pull back. The kiss was timid, quick, scared, but it was real. And they both knew that from there on, there was no going back. For weeks, they met in secret, always far from her father's eyes, always hidden, always afraid. But the fear wasn't bigger than what they felt. Caroline never imagined that loving could be so intense, so urgent, so forbidden. And Wade made her laugh, made her feel like the world was bigger than the ranch's fences. And she made him dream. Dream of a future that, deep down, they both knew was impossible. Until Richard Thornfield found out. He saw them together near the creek, holding hands, talking low, as if the whole world could collapse at any moment, and it did. Richard didn't yell. He was too smart to yell. He simply called Wade, and in front of all the employees, said with a cold, cutting voice, "You and your family have until the end of the day to get off my property." Caroline ran to her father, begged, cried, tried to explain, but Richard didn't want explanations. "You're a Thornfield, and he's the hired help's son. There's no future in that." "Dad, please. Enough, Caroline. You're going to New York tomorrow." She tried to see Wade before leaving, but he was already gone, expelled, humiliated, taken away with his family, without a chance to say goodbye. Wade's face was steady, but his eyes said everything he couldn't say. The next morning, as the car drove her away from the ranch, Caroline looked out the window and watched the dirt road fade into the distance. She saw the fences, saw the horizon she'd known since childhood. Ahead of her, years of studying in New York, a massive, noisy city where she'd be watched by her aunt at every turn, where the Thornfield name would weigh as much as the invisible bars that would keep her away from Wade. And she swore to herself, through tears she couldn't hold back, "I'll never forget you, Wade." She left without knowing that by leaving the ranch, she also left behind the part of herself that believed in the impossible. But what she didn't know was that years later, fate would bring them both back, and when that happened, nothing would be the same, because the humble boy she loved no longer existed. 7 years. 7 years since Caroline left Thornfield Ranch with a broken heart and a promise to never look back. But there she was, returning. The car moved slowly down the dirt road, kicking up red dust that mixed with the hot air of the Texas countryside. Caroline looked out the window and recognized every curve, every tree, every fence that marked her family's lands. Nothing had changed, and at the same time, everything was different. She was no longer the 17-year-old girl who left crying. Now she was 24, graduated in business management, determined, prepared to take over the family business, or at least that's what she tried to believe. When the car stopped in front of the main house, Caroline took a deep breath before getting out. The imposing structure, with its wide porches and white columns, was still there, dominating the landscape, as it always had. And on the porch, arms crossed, stood Richard Thornfield. He'd aged. His hair was grayer, the wrinkles around his eyes were deeper, but his posture remained the same. Rigid, authoritative, relentless. "Welcome back," he said without smiling. Caroline climbed the steps and greeted him with a nod. The relationship between them had never fully recovered after that day. Some wounds simply didn't heal. "Thank you, Dad. I hope you came prepared. The ranch isn't how you left it. Things have changed." "I know. That's why I'm here." Richard observed her for a moment, as if measuring his daughter, evaluating whether she really had what it took to command the Thornfield legacy. "Let's see if you prove that," he said before entering the house. Caroline stood on the porch, looking at the lands that stretched as far as the eye could see. The feeling was strange. She was home, but didn't feel at home. In the following days, she dove into work, reviewed contracts, talked with employees, inspected facilities, tried to understand every detail of the operation. And in every meeting, every decision, Richard was there watching, controlling, making it clear that even with her back, he was still the one in charge. Caroline knew she needed to prove her worth, not to others, but to herself. Until one afternoon, during a conversation with the ranch administrator, she heard something that made her heart stop. "The neighboring lands were bought 3 years ago," the man explained, pointing to the map spread on the table. "The new owner renovated everything, expanded. Today it's one of the most prosperous properties in the region." Caroline looked at the map. The lands were right next to Thornfield Ranch, a direct border. "Who's the owner?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The administrator hesitated for a second, as if he knew this information wouldn't be well received. "Wade Mercer." The name hit Caroline like a punch to the stomach. Wade. She hadn't heard that name in years. She'd tried to forget, tried to move on, but there he was, back in her life in the most unexpected way. "Wade Mercer," she repeated, just to make sure she'd heard right. "Yes, ma'am, the former Foreman's son. He came back a few years ago, bought the Harrison lands when they went bankrupt. Nobody thought he'd make it, but he did." Caroline felt her hands tremble. She hid them behind her back, breathing deep to maintain composure. "I see." It was all she managed to say. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stayed on the bedroom balcony, looking at the dark horizon, trying to process what she'd discovered. Wade was back. Not just back. He owned land, was prosperous, successful. The poor boy who was expelled from the ranch now commanded a property next to hers. The irony was almost cruel. Caroline wondered if he knew she'd returned, if he cared, if he still remembered what they'd lived, or if for him it was all just the past. She leaned her head against the porch column and closed her eyes. Wade's face was still there, stored somewhere deep in her memory. The shy smile, the intense gaze, the way he held her hand as if afraid of losing her. But 7 years was a long time. People changed. Life changed. And maybe the Wade she loved no longer existed. Maybe he'd become someone else, someone she didn't know, someone she maybe didn't even want to know. The next morning, during breakfast, Richard dropped the information as if it were casual. Wade Mercer bought the Harrison lands. Caroline raised her eyes from her plate but said nothing. He came back and, apparently, did well for himself. Richard continued with a tone that mixed contempt with something that seemed like reluctant respect. "I heard," Caroline responded, keeping her voice neutral. Richard stared at her. "I hope you don't have any absurd ideas in your head." "What kind of ideas?" "You know what I'm talking about, Caroline." "The past stayed in the past, and that's where it should remain." She held the coffee cup tighter than necessary. "I came back to work, Dad, not to relive the past." Richard nodded, but his look said he didn't entirely believe that. And maybe he was right, because that afternoon when Caroline was inspecting the fences that divided the properties, she saw something that made time stop. On the other side of the fence, mounted on a horse, was a tall man, broad shoulders, hat hiding part of his face. But she didn't need to see his face to know who it was. Wade. He saw her too. For a long moment, they both stood still, separated only by a wire fence, but the distance seemed much greater than that. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just looked at her. And in that look, Caroline saw everything she needed to see. He remembered. And he hadn't forgotten. The real encounter happened 3 days later. Caroline was at the town's supply cooperative, handling procurement issues when she heard his voice. Deep, firm, different from what she kept in her memory, but unmistakable. She turned her head slowly, as if the sudden movement might make everything disappear. And there he was. Wade, standing, talking with the cooperative manager, arms crossed, wearing a dark button-down shirt and a hat that hid part of his face. But she could see enough. See the man he'd become. His shoulders were broader, his posture more confident. His face had lost the softness of youth and gained lines that revealed years of hard work and determination. He wasn't the boy she'd known anymore. He was someone else. And at the same time, he was still him. Caroline felt her heart race, her hands sweat. She wanted to leave before he saw her, but it was too late. Wade turned his head and their eyes met. For a second, the world stopped. He didn't smile, showed no surprise, just looked at her. And in that look there was something Caroline couldn't decipher. Was it anger? Was it hurt? Or simply indifference? She took a deep breath and decided she wouldn't run. Not this time. She finished the conversation with the attendant, grabbed the papers she needed, and walked toward him. Each step felt heavier than the last. "Wade," she said, her voice coming out lower than intended. He stared at her without hurry, as if evaluating every detail. After a silence that lasted too long, he responded, "Caroline Thornfield." The last name sounded like a barrier, a reminder of everything that separated them. "I heard you bought the Harrison lands," she tried, looking for some starting point. "Congratulations." Wade gave a half smile, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was ironic, bitter. "Thanks. Must be strange for you, right? The hired help's son now being a landowner." The phrase cut deep. "It's not about that," Caroline responded, trying to stay calm. "Oh, no." Wade tilted his head, eyes fixed on her. "Then what's it about, Caroline? About how you disappeared without looking back, or about how your father destroyed my family's life?" She felt her chest tighten. She knew this moment would come, but she didn't imagine it would hurt this much. "I didn't have a choice," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Everyone has a choice," he shot back coldly. "You chose to obey your father. I understand, but don't act like we were victims in the same way. You went back home. I was expelled." Caroline opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come because he was right. Part of her had known that all along. "Wade, you don't need to explain," he interrupted, adjusting his hat. "The past stayed in the past. We're here now, each taking care of what's ours. Better to leave it that way." He took a step to leave, but Caroline instinctively reached out and grabbed his arm. "Wait!" The touch was brief, but it was enough. Wade stopped instantly, the muscles in his arm tensed under her fingers. And for a second, everything came back. The afternoons hidden in the barn, the whispered conversations, the way he held her hand as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Caroline felt her breath fail. Wade looked at her hand on his arm, then raised his eyes and stared at her. And this time she saw it, saw everything he was trying to hide, the hurt, the anger, and worst of all, the pain that had never gone away. She let go of his arm slowly, as if the simple act of pulling her hand away could undo what that touch had awakened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Wade took a step back, recomposing his cold expression. "You don't need to," he said, his voice firm, but with an almost imperceptible crack. "Take care of your ranch, Caroline, and I'll take care of mine." He turned his back and left the cooperative without looking back. Caroline stood in the middle of the aisle, feeling the weight of the silence he left behind. People around continued their conversations. Life went on, but for her, everything had stopped. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm the heart that beat out of rhythm. That touch, that damn touch, had been quick, insignificant to anyone else, but for her it had been like touching a wound that never healed. And from the way Wade had reacted, he felt the same thing. That night, Caroline couldn't get the reunion out of her head. She sat on the bedroom balcony, looking at the dark horizon, replaying every word, every look, every second of that encounter. Wade had changed. That was undeniable. He was no longer the sweet, shy boy she'd known. Now he was hard, closed off, armored against anything that could hurt him again. And she couldn't blame him for that. But at the same time, a part of her, the part that had never stopped loving him, wanted to break through that armor, wanted to touch the person he still was underneath all that coldness. Caroline closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wooden column. Maybe it was impossible. Maybe time had destroyed everything they once were. But one thing she knew for sure, that touch hadn't been accidental. And what it awakened inside her was far from over. The news reached Richard Thornfield before Caroline even had the courage to tell him. Someone saw them at the cooperative. Someone always saw. In the countryside, eyes were everywhere. When Caroline returned to the ranch that afternoon, her father was waiting for her in the living room, sitting in the leather armchair with a glass of whiskey in hand, and an expression she knew all too well, controlled anger, that look she'd known since childhood, the look that preceded punishment. "Sit down," he ordered without looking at her. Caroline obeyed, feeling her stomach tighten. She knew what was coming. "Dad, you're exaggerating." "Exaggerating?" His voice rose. "I got him out of here for a reason, Caroline. And if you think time changed anything, you're wrong. He's still the same. And you're still a Thornfield." The last name fell like a sentence. Caroline squeezed her hands in her lap, feeling anger rise. "I know who I am, Dad." "Then act like it." Richard approached, looking directly into her eyes. "I forbid you from having any contact with Wade Mercer. Understood." Caroline held his gaze. She wanted to scream, wanted to say she wasn't a teenager he could control anymore. But her father's voice had that weight, that power that always silenced her. "Understood," she said, but the word came out dry, without conviction. Richard nodded and returned to his chair, as if the matter were settled. But for Caroline, it was just beginning. The cattle auction happened 3 days later. It was one of the region's most important events. Ranchers from various towns gathered to negotiate, and Caroline knew Wade would be there. She tried to prepare mentally, wore modest clothes, tied her hair back, rehearsed a professional posture. She needed to show she was there for business, nothing more. But when she arrived at the pavilion and saw Wade on the other side of the pen, leaning on the rail with a group of ranchers around him, everything she'd rehearsed crumbled. He wore a dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and that same hat that hid half his face. Time had molded him. The sweet boy was buried under layers of strength and silence, but she could see it in the confident smile, the smile of someone who knew exactly where he stood. And when his eyes met hers, the smile grew even bigger. Provocative. Caroline looked away and tried to focus on the auction, but it was impossible. She felt his eyes on her the whole time. The auctioneer opened bids for a high-lineage breeding bull. Several ranchers started bidding. Caroline watched silently, calculating whether it was worth entering the competition, until Wade raised his hand. 50,000, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Murmurs began. It was a high, aggressive bid. Caroline bit her lip. She needed that bull. The ranch needed to improve the herd. But entering the dispute against Wade there, in front of everyone, would be 55, she said, raising her hand. The silence was immediate. All eyes turned to her, then to Wade. He tilted his head, the smile still on his lips. 60. Caroline felt her heart race. He wasn't there for the bull. He was there for her. 65. Wade took a step forward, crossing his arms. 75. One of the ranchers beside Caroline murmured, "He's provoking you." Caroline knew that. Everyone knew. But backing down now would be admitting defeat. And she couldn't do that. 80, she said, her voice firm but her chest tight. Wade stared at her for a long moment. The entire pavilion seemed to hold its breath. And then he smiled. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was something worse. It was a smile that said, "I got what I wanted." "It's yours," he said simply before turning his back and leaving the pen. Caroline stood there, holding the bid number, feeling curious eyes around her. She'd won, but the feeling was of defeat, because Wade didn't want the bull. He wanted to make her pay more, wanted to see her fight, wanted to prove he still had power over her, and he'd succeeded. Later, when Caroline was leaving the pavilion trying to control the anger burning in her chest, she heard his voice behind her. "Congratulations on the purchase." She stopped, took a deep breath, and then turned, facing him. "What do you want, Wade?" He was leaning against his truck, arms crossed, that calm, controlled expression that irritated her deeply. "Nothing. I just thought it was interesting to see you fighting over a bull worth half of what you paid." Caroline took a step toward him, eyes blazing with anger. "You provoked me in front of everyone." "Why?" Wade pushed off the truck and came closer. Too close. "Because I can," he said, his voice low but cutting. "Because now I have money, I have land, I have respect. And you can't pretend I don't exist anymore." Caroline felt her chest burn. "I never pretended that." "No?" Wade tilted his head. "Then why didn't you come after me? Why didn't you fight?" The question cut deep. "I was a child, Wade. I didn't have a choice. And now—" He moved even closer, his voice loaded with something she couldn't name. "Now you have a choice, Caroline. And still, you keep obeying your father." The phrase hit a point she didn't even know still hurt. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words died in her throat, because he was right. And the truth hurt more than any provocation. Wade stepped back, adjusting his hat. "Enjoy the bull," he said, before getting in his truck and driving off, leaving a cloud of dust in the air. Caroline stood in the middle of the parking lot, feeling the weight of his words. She'd won the auction, but lost something money couldn't buy: the certainty of who she was. And the worst part was knowing that Wade had exposed the truth she feared most. Even as an adult, she was still a prisoner of her own name. The boundary dispute started with an error in old documents. Someone had registered the property limits wrong decades ago, and now, with Wade as owner of the neighboring lands, this needed to be resolved. Caroline tried to handle it the official way. Sent emails, called the lawyer, proposed a technical meeting. But Wade didn't make anything easy. He ignored the emails, didn't return calls, and when he finally agreed to meet, he chose the place, the fence that divided the two properties. Caroline arrived first, holding the documents tightly, trying to prepare for another round of provocations. The sun was strong, the midday heat making everything even more suffocating. And when she saw his truck approaching, kicking up dust on the dirt road, her heart raced. Wade got out of the vehicle with that irritating calm, hat on his head, sunglasses hiding his look, light shirt with rolled sleeves. He seemed in control of everything, and that irritated her deeply. "You took your time," Caroline said, trying to sound professional. "I have a ranch to take care of," he responded, taking off his sunglasses and looking directly at her. "Unlike you, who just came back to play rancher." The provocation came quick, sharp. Caroline took a deep breath, holding back her anger. "I didn't come here to discuss that. I came to resolve the boundary issue." "Oh yeah?" Wade crossed his arms, leaning on the fence. "And what's the problem exactly?" She opened the documents and pointed to the map. "The old records are inconsistent. The current fence doesn't match what's on paper. We need to do a new survey." Wade looked at the map, then at the fence, and shrugged. "The fence has been there for decades. It's never been a problem before." "But now it is," Caroline insisted, "because now you're the owner, and I need to make sure everything's correct." He stared at her for a long moment, and then smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Ah, I get it. You're afraid I'm invading your precious Thornfield lands." "Is that it?" "It's not about that." "Yes, it is," he interrupted, taking a step forward. "It's always about that, Caroline, about the name, about the property, about keeping everything the way it's always been. Doesn't matter who gets hurt along the way." Caroline felt anger rise. "You don't know anything about what I went through." "I don't." His voice got louder. "I was expelled from my home, Caroline. My family lost everything. And you just disappeared. Not one letter, not one call. Nothing." "I was being watched," she shouted back, eyes burning. "My aunt controlled every step I took. I couldn't do anything without my father knowing." "Then you're a coward," he said, his voice cutting. "Because even after you became an adult, you kept obeying." The word hit hard. Caroline took a step forward, furious. "I'm not a coward. I came back. I'm facing my father. I'm here. You came back because it was convenient. Wade shot back, coming closer. "You came back because the ranch needed you, not because I was here. You think this is easy for me?" Her voice trembled. "You think I didn't think about you all these years, that I didn't carry this with me?" Wade stopped inches from her, so close she could feel the heat from his body, the heavy breathing, the anger mixed with something much more dangerous. "Then why didn't you do anything?" he asked, his voice low but intense. "Why did you just accept it?" Caroline looked into his eyes, and something inside her broke. "And because I was scared," she whispered, her voice failing. "Scared that you'd forgotten me. Scared that what we had meant nothing to you." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded. Wade looked at her as if seeing something for the first time. And then, without warning, without thinking, he grabbed her face with both hands and pulled her to him. The kiss was explosive. It wasn't delicate, wasn't soft. It was anger, hurt, desire repressed for years. It was everything they couldn't say with words. Caroline felt the world spin. His hands were firm on her face, his lips demanding, almost desperate, and she responded with the same intensity, grabbing his shirt, pulling him closer, as if wanting to recover all the lost time in a single moment. It was wrong, it was dangerous, but it was impossible to stop. Until Wade pulled away abruptly, as if he'd been burned. He stepped back, running his hand through his hair, his breathing uneven, eyes wide. This was a mistake," he said, his voice hoarse. Caroline stood there, chest rising and falling rapidly, lips still burning. "Wade, no," he interrupted, shaking his head. "This can't happen again." He grabbed the hat that had fallen to the ground, put it back on his head, and turned his back, walking toward the truck. Caroline stayed there, alone, with the documents fallen on the ground and the taste of him still on her lips. Her heart was beating so hard she thought it would explode. That hadn't been just a kiss. It had been the confession that no matter how much they wanted to pretend, no matter how hard they tried to stay away, what existed between them was far from over. And now, after that kiss, there was no going back. The fire that time tried to extinguish had just been reignited, and this time it would burn everything. Caroline couldn't stop thinking about that kiss. She tried. God knows she tried. She dove into work, reviewed contracts, inspected cattle, spent hours in the office analyzing numbers that blurred in front of her eyes. But it didn't help. Every moment of silence, the memory came back. The taste of his lips, the heat of his hands on her face, the desperate way he'd pulled her close, as if he were starving for something only she could give. And worse, the way she'd responded, without hesitating, without thinking, as if 7 years of distance had never existed. She pressed her forehead on the desk and closed her eyes. This couldn't continue. It couldn't. But her body disagreed. Her heart disagreed. And the deepest part, the one she'd tried to bury in New York, screamed that that kiss was only the beginning. On the other side of the fence, Wade was also struggling. He woke up early, worked until his body hurt, spent the entire day busy with the ranch. Anything to not think, anything to not feel. But at night, when exhaustion should bring sleep, he'd stay on the porch, looking at the horizon, and he knew she was there, on the other side, maybe also unable to sleep, maybe also reliving every second of that moment. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion. It had been a mistake. He knew that. It had been crossing a line he swore never to cross again, because Caroline Thornfield was everything he wanted to forget, everything he needed to leave behind to move forward. But the taste of her was still in his mouth. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't erase it. The physical distance didn't help at all. The properties were neighbors. The fences divided the lands, but didn't stop the glances. And every time Caroline was near the boundary, every time he drove by on the road, they saw each other. and each time it happened, the air got heavier. They didn't exchange words, didn't approach, but the silence said everything. Wade looked away first, always, as if looking too long would be admitting he still felt, still wanted. And Caroline stood there, heart tight, watching him go. It was on one of those afternoons, as Caroline was returning from the corral, that Richard intercepted her. He was on the main house porch, arms crossed, that expression she knew all too well, the expression of someone who knew something. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice dry. Caroline climbed the steps slowly, feeling her stomach tighten. "About what?" Richard entered the house and she followed. He got straight to the point. "You're different." "Different how?" "Distracted. Distant. Your head's not in the business." Caroline crossed her arms, trying to maintain her posture. "I'm working every day, Dad, doing everything that needs to be done. But not the way you should." He approached, his eyes fixed on her. "Something's happening, Duck, and I want to know what." "Nothing's happening." "Don't lie to me, Caroline." His voice was low but loaded with authority, that tone that always silenced her, that always made her obey. She looked away, but didn't respond. Richard took a deep breath as if trying to control his own anger. "I already warned you. I don't want you near Wade Mercer. And if you think I don't know what's happening, you're wrong. Everyone in this region talks, and I won't allow you to destroy this family's name again." "Again?" Caroline raised her eyes, anger bubbling. "I never destroyed anything." "You did. You expelled his family. You sent me away." "And I'd do it again," Richard said without hesitating. "Because that boy isn't for you. Never was, and never will be." Caroline felt tears burn, but refused to let them fall. "You can't control my life forever. I can while you're under my roof and while this ranch is still mine." The threat was clear, and Caroline knew he wasn't bluffing. She left the room without saying anything more, went up to her room and locked the door. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, chest tight. Her father was right about one thing. She couldn't continue like this, divided between duty and desire, between the name she carried and the man she never stopped loving. But the question that wouldn't be silenced was, what was she willing to sacrifice? That night, Caroline had a dream. She was back in the barn. Rain pounded on the tin roof, and Wade was there, young, smiling in that shy way she loved so much. He extended his hand, and she took it. But when she tried to get closer, a fence appeared between them, tall, insurmountable, and on the other side, Wade started walking away, disappearing into the darkness, while she screamed his name without any sound coming out. Caroline woke up startled, heart racing, breath caught. She looked out the window and saw the first lights of dawn, and she knew, with a certainty that hurt, that that dream was more than just a dream. It was a warning. If she didn't do something, if she stayed trapped by her father's control, by the weight of the last name, by the distance Wade was putting between them, she'd lose him again. And this time, it would be forever. The sun was rising outside, but inside her it was still dawn, because now, more than ever, she knew, if she didn't fight, she'd lose not just Wade, she'd lose herself. The smell of smoke arrived before the alarm. It was a dense, hot smell that stuck in the throat before she even understood what was happening. Caroline was in the office when she smelled it. She lifted her head, frowned, and went to the window. On the horizon, a column of gray smoke rose to the sky. Her heart raced. "Fire!" she shouted, running out of the house. The employees were already moving. Someone called the fire department. Another grabbed hoses. Chaos installed in seconds. Caroline ran to the truck, started the engine, and accelerated toward the smoke. The wind was strong. If the fire spread, it could devour acres of pasture in minutes. When she got close to the boundary, she saw the flames, tall, violent, running along the fence that separated the two properties, and on the other side, already in action, were Wade and his men. They were using hoses, beaters, shovels. Working fast, trying to contain the advance of the flames before they reached the wooded areas. Caroline got out of the truck and ran to help. "Wade!" she shouted over the noise of the fire. He turned his head. His face was dirty with soot, sweat running down his forehead, but their eyes met, and for a second, the world stopped. "Are your animals near here?" he shouted back. "Yes, in the pasture to the right." "Go get them." "I'll hold the fire here." Caroline hesitated for a second, but he was right. The animals were priority. She ran back to the truck, got the employees who had just arrived, and together they started moving the cattle away from the danger zone. The heat was unbearable. The smoke burned their lungs, the wind blew ashes in her face, and each step felt like a battle against fear itself. But they worked without stopping. It took almost an hour to contain the fire. When the flames finally diminished and the firefighters arrived to finish the job, Caroline stopped, bent over, trying to catch her breath. Her hands were shaking, her whole body ached, but the cattle was safe. Both properties were safe. She wiped the sweat from her face with her shirt sleeve and looked around. That's when she saw Wade. He was sitting on the ground, leaning against his truck, head tilted back, eyes closed. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His shirt was soaked with sweat and dirt. Caroline walked to him slowly, her heart still beating hard. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the smoke. Wade opened his eyes and looked at her. "I'm alive," he responded with a tired half-smile. She sat down beside him, also exhausted. They stayed there for a moment in silence, listening to the sound of the firefighters finishing the work in the background. "Thank you," Caroline said finally. "I wasn't going to let the fire take your property," Wade interrupted, looking ahead. "Even if your father thinks I'm the enemy." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the man he was now, strong, determined, but still with that remnant of kindness she'd always loved. "But you're not the enemy, Wade." He turned his face to her, and this time there was no anger in his look, just exhaustion and something else, something vulnerable. "I don't know if your father agrees with that." "I don't care what my father thinks," she said, and it was the first time she admitted that out loud. Wade was silent, processing her words. "You should care," he said quietly. "Because he still has power over you." "Not more than I allow." The wind blew, bringing the smell of burned earth mixed with the relief that the worst had passed. Wade ran his hand over his face, leaving clean tracks in the soot. "You could have died in there," Caroline whispered, her voice failing. "You went into the fire to protect my property." "Why?" He took time to answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice was loaded with something he'd tried to hide for so long. "Because no matter how hard I try to hate you, Caroline, I can't." The words fell between them like a confession. She felt something inside her crumble. The pride, the guilt, the fear. Everything collapsed at once. Caroline felt her eyes burn. It wasn't from the smoke. "Wade, I spent 7 years trying to forget you," he continued, his voice low but firm. "I built all this, came back, proved myself, but when I saw you again, none of it mattered, because you're still the only person who makes me feel like I'm not just the hired help's son." Her breath failed. "You were never just that to me." "I know," he said, turning his body to face her. But I needed to hear it again. And then, without thinking, without calculating, Caroline leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't like the first time. It didn't have anger, didn't have hurt. It was relief. It was gratitude. It was the certainty that he was alive, that she was alive, that despite everything, they were still there. Wade responded instantly. His hands, still dirty with soot, rose to her face, holding her as if she might disappear at any moment. The kiss started soft, but soon gained depth, His hands moved up her neck, tangling in her hair. She responded, pulling him gently, as if the touch were the only thing keeping her alive. It was slow, deep, full of everything they didn't have the courage to say. It was the memory of what they'd lived, the barn, the rain, first love. And it was the promise that maybe there was still a future. When they separated, they both stayed still, foreheads touching, breathing mixed. "This is going to complicate everything," Wade whispered. "I know," Caroline responded, eyes still closed. "Your father's going to lose it." "I know, and we might hurt each other again." Caroline opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "I know. But I don't care anymore." Wade looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time in years, he smiled. A real smile, without bitterness, without pain. "You've gone crazy." "Probably," she responded, smiling too. And there, in the middle of the soot, the exhaustion, the smell of burned earth, they both understood something important. The fire that had almost destroyed everything that day wasn't the only one that had returned. The fire in the field was dying out, but the other one, the one burning inside them, had just been born again, and this time, no wind would be strong enough to extinguish it. The truth came out on a Thursday morning. Caroline was in the office when the family lawyer arrived, his face tense, carrying a folder of documents. "I need to speak with you and your father. It's urgent." Richard was called. He entered the room with that haughty posture as always, but Caroline noticed something different, a line of tension around his eyes, a weariness he tried to hide. The lawyer didn't waste time. "The ranch's financial situation is critical." Caroline frowned. "What do you mean, critical?" "Your father made risky investments in recent years, bought unnecessary machinery, expanded areas that didn't generate returns, and mainly took high-interest loans to maintain appearances." She looked at Richard, expecting him to deny it, but he just looked away. "Dad." "I had everything under control," he said, his voice harsh. "Had," the lawyer insisted. "Mr. Thornfield, with all respect, you don't. The creditors are demanding payment, and if we don't pay in 60 days, they'll execute the debt. That means losing part of the lands." The silence that followed was deafening. Caroline felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. "How much?" she asked, her voice trembling. The lawyer hesitated before answering. $3 million. Caroline closed her eyes. $3 million. There was no way to raise that money in 2 months. "What can we do?" "Renegotiate, sell part of the property, or find someone to buy the debt." Richard stood abruptly, the chair scraping on the floor. "Nobody's going to buy anything. I'll solve this." "Dad, you can't just ignore—" "I said I'll solve it," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. And then he left the room, leaving Caroline alone with the lawyer and the weight of a truth she wasn't prepared to face. The following weeks were a roller coaster. Caroline tried everything. Talked to banks, looked for investors, tried to sell cattle, machines, anything that could generate cash, but it wasn't enough. Richard, on his part, refused to accept help. He locked himself in the office, drank more than he should, and pretended everything was under control. Until one afternoon, the lawyer called again. "Caroline, someone made an offer." Her heart raced. "Who?" There was a pause. "Wade Mercer." The name dropped like a bomb. "What?" "He offered to buy the debt, all of it, in exchange for a portion of the lands." Caroline felt the air leave her lungs. "No, it can't be." "Caroline, it's the only offer we have. If you don't accept, the bank will execute everything, and then you'll lose much more." She hung up the phone and stood there, staring at nothing. Wade. He'd done exactly what her father had always been afraid he'd do. He'd waited for the right moment, and now he had the power in his hands. Caroline knew she needed to confront him. She went to his property that same afternoon. Wade was at the corral, inspecting the cattle when he saw her arrive. He stopped, took off his hat, and waited. "I need to talk to you," Caroline said, getting out of the truck. "I figured you'd come." "You bought my father's debt?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Wade put the hat back on his head, eyes fixed on her. "I did." "Why?" "Because someone was going to buy it. And I preferred it to be me." Caroline took a step forward, anger bubbling. "You did this for revenge, to humiliate my father." "No," Wade said, his voice calm but firm. "I did this to save you." The answer caught her by surprise. "What?" Wade sighed, running his hand over his face. "Caroline, if I hadn't bought it, the bank would have executed everything. You'd have lost the entire ranch. At least this way, you still have the house, the cattle, most of the lands. I only took enough to cover the debt." She was silent, processing. "But now you have control over part of my property." "No, I have part of the lands, but you're still the one in charge. I won't interfere unless you ask me to." Caroline felt tears burn, but refused to let them fall. "My father's going to lose it." "I know," Wade said quietly. "But he should have thought about that before destroying everything out of pride." She looked at him and saw something she didn't expect. It wasn't satisfaction, wasn't revenge. It was concern. "You did this for me," she whispered. Wade took a step forward, getting close enough for her to feel his warmth. "I've always done everything for you, Caroline, since day one." The confession hung in the air. Caroline didn't know if she wanted to kiss him or scream at him, maybe both. "And now," she asked, her voice failing, "how do I explain this to my father?" "You don't explain," Wade responded. "You face him." When Caroline returned home, she found Richard waiting on the porch. He already knew. Someone had told him. "So it's true," he said, his voice trembling with contained rage. "You went to his property. I needed to understand what was happening." "Understand?" Richard took a step forward, eyes red. "He bought the debt, Caroline. That boy now has part of our lands, and you went there to talk to him like nothing happened. He saved the ranch, Dad. If it weren't for him, we'd have lost everything." "Lost?" Richard gave a bitter laugh. "I'd rather have lost everything than owe anything to him. That's pride talking. Stupid pride that almost destroyed this family." The phrase came out before she could contain it. Richard went pale. And then, for the first time, Caroline saw something she'd never seen before. He collapsed. Not physically, but something inside him broke. "I just wanted to protect you," he said, his voice failing. "I wanted you to have a worthy future away from people like him." "People like him?" Caroline felt anger return. "He's a landowner, Dad. He built everything from nothing. He's more worthy than half the ranchers you call friends." Richard looked at her as if seeing a stranger. "You're in love with him again, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and the pain in his voice was undeniable. Caroline took a deep breath. "I never stopped being." The silence that followed was heavy. Final. Richard turned his back and entered the house without saying anything more, and Caroline stayed alone on the porch, knowing that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The power had changed hands, and she was in the middle of the war between the two men she loved most in life. The Harvest Festival was tradition at Thornfield Ranch. Every year at the end of the season, the property opened its doors to employees, neighbors, and acquaintances. It was a celebration of work, of the land, of the life the countryside provided. But that year, everything felt different. Caroline was in the decorated hall, wearing a simple cotton dress, trying to smile at the guests who greeted her, but her heart was heavy. In recent weeks, her relationship with her father had become a tense silence. Richard barely spoke to her. He spent his days locked in the office, staring at documents he didn't solve, drinking more than he should. And Wade. Wade had kept his distance after that conversation, as if he knew she needed time to process everything. But time hadn't solved anything. It had only made everything more confusing. Music played in the background. Country guitar, accordion, the cheerful rhythm that contrasted with the turmoil inside her. Caroline grabbed a glass of juice and went out to the porch, looking for fresh air. And that's when she saw him. Wade was near the corral, leaning on the fence, alone, looking at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. He wore a dark dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, hat on his head. And even from a distance, she felt his presence like a magnet. Her heart raced. Caroline took a deep breath and made a decision. She walked down the porch steps and headed toward him. Wade saw her approaching. He didn't look away, just waited. "You came?" she said, stopping a few steps from him. "I was invited," he responded with a half-smile. "Thought it would be strange to refuse, since I'm now an involuntary partner." The irony in his voice was light, but it was there. Caroline leaned on the fence beside him, looking at the same horizon. "My father didn't come down to the hall. Said he wasn't feeling well. I figured." They stayed in silence for a moment. The music from the party reached them, muffled by distance. The smell of earth and freshly cut grass filled the air. "Wade," Caroline started, but her voice failed. He turned his face to her, waiting. "I don't know what to do anymore," she confessed, her voice low. "I'm stuck between you and my father, between what I want and what I should do." Wade sighed, taking off his hat and running his hand through his hair. "You don't owe me anything, Caroline. But I owe him. He's my father." "Does that mean you have to give up your life for him?" The question cut deep. Caroline closed her eyes. "He's broken, Wade. Since you bought the debt, he's not the same." "Good," Wade said, and the hardness in his voice made her look at him. "Because he destroyed my family without blinking, and now that the power shifted, he feels what we felt." Caroline felt anger rise. "You still want revenge, then?" "Is that it?" "No." Wade turned to her, his voice louder. "It's not about revenge, Caroline. It's about justice. About him finally understanding that he can't control everything and everyone." "He already understands," she shouted back. "He's already paid. Isn't that enough?" Wade took a step forward, eyes fixed on her. "And you? When are you going to stop paying for his mistakes?" The question hung in the air. Caroline felt tears burn. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know how to do that." Wade took a deep breath, trying to control his own emotions. "I spent 7 years building all this," he said, his voice lower now. 7 years working day and night, proving I was worth something. And you know why? Because I wanted to be worthy of you. I wanted that if we ever met again, you wouldn't feel ashamed of me." Caroline felt her chest tighten. "Wade, I never—" "I know," he interrupted. "I know you never felt that way. But I did. Every time your father looked at me like I was nothing, I felt it. And that destroyed me as much as losing you." Her tears finally fell. "I lost too, Wade. I lost you. I lost myself. I was sent away, watched, controlled, as if the love I felt was something wrong. And I carried that guilt all these years." Wade was silent, eyes fixed on her. "You think it was easy for me?" she continued, her voice trembling. "Seeing my father fall apart, knowing that the only person who can save the ranch is you, and at the same time, knowing that every time I look at you, I still feel everything I felt at 17. The confession came out raw, true. Wade took another step forward. Now they were so close she could see his breathing, feel the heat. "You feel it?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, I never stopped feeling it, Caroline responded, tears streaming down her face. Wade closed his eyes as if fighting something inside him. And then, slowly, he raised his hand and wiped a tear from her face with his thumb. The touch was gentle, careful. I've loved you my whole life, Caroline, he said, his voice breaking. Even when I tried to hate you, even when I swore I'd forget you, I never could. Caroline sobbed, bringing her hand to her chest as if she could contain the pain overflowing. I love you too, she whispered. I always have. And then, without thinking, she threw herself into his arms. Wade caught her instantly, pulling her close, arms wrapping around her tightly, as if holding the only thing that mattered in the world. It wasn't a kiss. It was an embrace. But it was the most sincere, most desperate, most necessary embrace either of them had ever given. Bodies pressed together, trembling with the weight of everything they'd held inside. Her hands clutching his back, fingers digging into his shirt, his head buried in her hair, breathing deep, as if needing to remember what it was like to have her so close. Caroline cried. Cried for everything they'd lost, for all the time they'd been apart, for the pain they'd carried alone. And Wade held her, just held her, because it was all he could do. After so long running, so long fighting, so long pretending they didn't feel, there in that embrace, they finally surrendered. When they separated, they both had red eyes, heavy breathing. We can't keep going like this, Caroline said, wiping her face. I know. I need to choose. Wade held her face with both hands, forcing her to look into his eyes. Then choose yourself, Caroline. For the first time in your life, choose yourself. The words echoed inside her, and for the first time, she understood what she needed to do. It wasn't about choosing between her father and Wade. It was about choosing herself and everything that came with it. The conversation with her father had been the hardest of Caroline's life. She'd entered the office, found Richard sitting in the leather chair, glass of whiskey in hand, empty gaze fixed on the window, and she'd said everything. Said she loved Wade, that she'd always loved him, that she wouldn't give up her own life anymore to protect the pride of a man who never asked what she really wanted. Richard didn't yell, didn't slam the table. He just looked at her as if seeing a stranger, and then, with his voice low and tired, said only one thing. Then you're no longer my daughter. The words cut, but Caroline didn't back down. If loving someone makes me stop being your daughter, then so be it. And she left. Now, hours later, she was on the ranch house porch, alone, watching the sun descend on the horizon. The hot wind came through the cracks, bringing the smell of earth and distant coffee. The ranch breathed around her, but inside her chest, everything was silent. She'd made the choice, and for the first time in years, she felt she'd made the right choice. That's when she heard the sound of tires on the dirt road. Caroline turned her head and saw Wade's truck approaching. Her heart raced. He parked in front of the ranch house, got out slowly, and took off his hat, holding it in his hands. They looked at each other from a distance, and in that look, everything was said. Wade climbed the porch steps, stopping a few steps from her. I heard, he said, his voice low. Heard what? That you faced your father, Caroline nodded, eyes welling up. I couldn't live that way anymore. Wade took another step forward. Came to tell you something. She waited, heart pounding hard. I gave up, he said, and his voice had something different, something light. Gave up the anger, the resentment, trying to prove something, because none of it matters if I don't have you. Caroline felt tears stream down. Wade, I love you, Caroline, he interrupted, taking the last step that separated them. I've loved you since the day you stumbled in the barn. I love you despite everything that happened, and I'll love you until the last day of my life. She sobbed, bringing her hand to her chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "I always have, and I'm tired of fighting against it." Wade held her face with both hands, thumbs wiping the tears. "Then don't fight anymore." And he kissed her. This time there was no anger, no desperation, no fear. It was just love, pure, true, inevitable. The kiss started soft, almost timid, as if they were both rediscovering the taste of each other. But soon it gained depth, gained urgency. His hands moved from her face to her waist, pulling her close. Her hands went up to his neck, fingers tangling in his hair. The breathing got heavy. Bodies fit together as if they were never meant to be apart. Wade pulled her inside the ranch house, without breaking the kiss, stumbling over their own steps but not caring. When they reached her room, he stopped for a second, looking into her eyes, as if asking permission, and Caroline answered by pulling him back to her. They fell onto the bed intertwined, hands exploring, lips seeking every inch of exposed skin. The wind came through the open window, moving the white linen curtains. The golden light of sunset bathed the room, creating soft shadows on the walls. Wade kissed her neck slowly, feeling the accelerated pulse under his lips. Caroline arched her body, fingers pressing into his back, pulling him closer, as if there wasn't a distance small enough. Clothes were removed slowly, between deep kisses and contained sighs. Each touch was a promise, each brush of skin a healing. When they finally came together, it wasn't just physical. It was the fusion of two souls that had been forcibly separated and now finally found each other again. The movements were slow, deep, synchronized. Breaths mixed, hearts beat in the same rhythm. Caroline held his face, forcing him to look into her eyes. "I'm yours," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "And I'm yours," he responded, forehead pressed to hers. And in that moment, everything they'd lost, everything they'd suffered, was worth it. Because there, in that room, in that embrace, in that complete surrender, they were no longer the hired help's son and the boss's daughter. They were just Wade and Caroline, two people who had loved, lost, fought, and finally won. Afterward, when their bodies calmed and breathing returned to normal, they lay side by side, fingers intertwined, looking at the ceiling. The silence was peaceful, complete. Wade turned his head and looked at her. "What do we do now?" Caroline smiled for the first time in days. "We live." He smiled too, pulling her closer, wrapping her in his arms. And outside, the ranch slept under the starry sky. But inside that room, two hearts beat in the same rhythm. For the first time without fear, without guilt, without barriers, just free. Finally, free. 3 weeks passed since that night. Caroline had moved to one of the smaller houses on the property, away from the main house, away from her father, but not away from the ranch, because the ranch was hers as much as it was his. She and Wade worked together now, joining efforts, planning the future, rebuilding what pride had almost destroyed. And slowly, Thornfield Ranch breathed again. But there was a wound that still hadn't healed. Richard. Caroline hadn't seen her father since the day she left the main house. He didn't reach out. She didn't go back. And the silence between them was an abyss that seemed impossible to cross. Until one Saturday morning, the phone rang. It was the ranch administrator. His voice was tense. "Caroline, you need to come. It's your father." Her heart raced. "What happened?" "He collapsed. He's at the hospital." Caroline hung up the phone and ran. The hospital was in town, 40 minutes away. Wade insisted on going with her, and for the first time, she didn't have the strength to face it alone. When they arrived, they found Richard in a hospital bed, pale, thin, connected to machines that beeped softly. He'd had a mild heart attack, nothing serious enough to kill him, but serious enough to scare him. Caroline entered the room slowly, heart tight. Richard turned his head when he saw her, and for the first time in weeks, their eyes met. "Caroline," he said, his voice weak. She approached the bed, holding her purse tightly to keep from trembling. "Hi, Dad." Richard looked at her for a long moment, and then his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Caroline felt her chest tighten. "Dad, let me speak," he breathed with difficulty. "I was wrong. Wrong with you, wrong with him, wrong with everyone." Her tears started to fall. "I just wanted to protect you," Richard continued, his voice failing. "But I went too far, and I almost lost the only thing that really matters, you." Caroline held his hand, squeezing gently. "You didn't lose me, Dad. I'm here." "But I don't deserve it," he said, closing his eyes. "After everything I did, nobody's perfect, Dad. You were wrong, but I was wrong too. We just need to try again." Richard opened his eyes and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You're stronger than I ever was." She smiled through the tears. "I learned from the best and the worst." Richard gave a low laugh that soon turned into a cough. "That's my punishment, having a daughter who inherited my stubbornness." Caroline laughed too, wiping her face. That's when Richard saw Wade standing in the doorway. His smile disappeared, but there was no anger, just exhaustion. "He came with you," Richard said, more as a statement than a question. "He did," Caroline responded, looking at Wade. Wade took a step forward, hesitant. "Mr. Thornfield." Richard was silent for a moment, and then, with a voice that carried the weight of years of broken pride, said, "I owe you an apology." Wade stopped, surprised. "I destroyed your family out of pure prejudice," Richard continued. "I thought I was protecting my daughter, but really I was protecting my own pride. And that was unforgivable." Wade took a deep breath, processing the words. "I spent years angry at you, sir," he said, his voice controlled. "But anger doesn't build anything. It only destroys." Richard nodded, eyes welling up. "And you're a better man than me, son." "I'm not," Wade responded. "I just got tired of carrying the weight of the past." There was a dense silence, and then Richard extended his trembling hand toward Wade. "Forgive me." Wade looked at the extended hand, looked at Caroline, and then took a step forward and held the hand of the man who had once expelled him from his home. "I forgive you." The two words echoed in the room like a sentence of liberation. Caroline covered her mouth with her hand, tears flowing freely. And there, in that hospital room, the cycle of pain and prejudice finally broke. 2 weeks later, Richard was discharged. He returned to the main house, but he was no longer the same man. His fragile health had forced him to slow down, and for the first time, he accepted help. Caroline and Wade took over complete administration of the ranch, and together they made a decision. They would unite the two properties. There would be no more fence dividing the lands, no more Thornfield side and Mercer side. It would all be one ranch, one family. The news spread through the region like wildfire. Some approved, others criticized, but Caroline didn't care. She'd learned that other people's opinions weren't worth more than her own peace. On the day the fence was removed, Caroline and Wade stood in the middle of the land, looking at the horizon that was now only theirs. "We did it," she said, smiling. "We did it," he repeated, pulling her close. And there, where once there'd been a barrier, now there was only land. Land they would cultivate together. Land that witnessed their love be born, die and be reborn. Richard, from a distance, watched from the main house porch. He still carried regrets, still carried guilt, but for the first time in years, he also carried hope, because his daughter hadn't given up on him. And maybe, just maybe, he could learn to be the man she'd always deserved to have as a father. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it opened space for a future where love was stronger than pride, And the ranch, which was once the stage of pain and separation, now became a symbol of redemption and new beginnings. 6 months passed. Thornfield Ranch breathed again. The pastures were green, the cattle healthy, the harvests abundant, and for the first time in years, the property didn't carry the weight of fear or pride. Just the natural rhythm of the land that produces, rests, and flourishes again. Caroline and Wade commanded together. Now there was no more division, no more his side or her side. It was all theirs, and it worked. They woke up early, had coffee side by side, reviewed the day's plans, discussed decisions. Sometimes they agreed, sometimes they disagreed, but they always ended up laughing, because they knew they were building something bigger than themselves. Richard had gradually stepped back, not bitterly, but consciously. His fragile health had forced him to slow down, and he finally accepted it was time to pass the torch. Now he spent his days on the main house porch, drinking coffee, reading newspapers, watching his daughter and son-in-law work. And for the first time, he felt pride. Real pride. Because his daughter hadn't just saved the ranch. She'd saved the family. The wedding happened on a spring morning. It wasn't a grand celebration. It didn't need to be. It was simple, intimate, true. The ceremony took place under a flowering cherry tree near the creek where Caroline and Wade used to meet when they were teenagers. Few guests, only the people who really mattered. Richard was there, sitting in the front row, eyes welling up. When Caroline entered, walking barefoot on the grass, wearing a simple white cotton dress, he couldn't hold back the tears. Because there was the daughter he'd almost lost. The daughter who, despite everything, still loved him. Wade waited under the tree, wearing a white shirt and dark pants, hat in his hands. And when he saw Caroline approaching, he smiled in that way only he knew how. With his eyes, with his whole soul. There was no priest. It was the ranch administrator, a simple man who'd known them both forever, who conducted the ceremony. The words were few, but each one weighed. You two came from different places. You went through things nobody should go through, but you chose love, and that's all that matters. Caroline and Wade exchanged simple bands of old gold that had belonged to his grandparents. And when they kissed, sealing the union, the wind blew the cherry petals around them, as if nature itself was celebrating. It was perfect. 2 weeks later, Caroline discovered. She'd noticed the signs, the fatigue, the sensitivity, the period that came and didn't return. And when she took the test, alone in the bathroom, and saw the 2 lines, the world stopped. She was pregnant. Caroline brought her hand to her belly, still flat, and felt tears stream down. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were of relief, of joy, of gratitude. She told Wade that same night. They were on the porch after dinner, looking at the stars, and she simply took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "There's someone here," she whispered. Wade took a few seconds to understand, and when he understood, his eyes filled with tears. We're going to have a baby." Caroline nodded, smiling through the tears. Wade pulled her into a tight hug, burying his face in her hair, breathing deep as if wanting to engrave that moment in memory forever. "I love you so much," he whispered, his voice choked, "so much it hurts." "I love you too," she responded, holding his face between her hands. "And now we're going to love this child together." And there, in that embrace, they understood the cycle had closed. The love that was forbidden, that was separated, that was tested in every way, now generated life. The next morning, Caroline woke before sunrise. She got out of bed carefully not to wake Wade, grabbed a shawl, and went to the area where months ago the fence had divided the properties. Now there was no more fence, just land, united land, land that breathed as one body. She stood there with her hand on her belly, feeling the cool dawn wind touch her face. The sky began to lighten. Shades of pink and orange painted the horizon, and then, slowly, the sun rose. Caroline closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about her father, about forgiveness, about the pain that almost destroyed them. She thought about Wade, about the boy he was, about the man he'd become. She thought about the child growing inside her, about the life beginning there, free of guilt, free of prejudice, free of barriers. And she understood that everything, each tear, each separation, each difficult choice, had been worth it. Because love wasn't just resisting, it was flourishing, transforming, putting down roots so deep that no storm could uproot them. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Wade was there, barefoot, shirt open, hair messy from sleep. "Thought you'd disappeared," he said with a smile. "I just came to watch the sunrise," she said. He approached and wrapped his arms around her from behind, hands resting on her belly. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he whispered. "It is," she responded. "And it's ours." They stood there in silence, watching the sun climb the sky. And in that moment, Caroline realized there was no more past, no more pain. There was only the now and the future growing inside her. Thornfield Ranch, which once witnessed the forbidden love of two teenagers, was now home to a family. And that love that was separated, tested, almost destroyed, had become root, harvest, and eternity. The new dawn wasn't just the sun rising on the horizon. It was the promise that from there on, everything would be different, and it would be better. She looked at the horizon and knew nothing would be as it was before. Her life, his life, and the life growing inside her were the same dawn. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to be happy, because love had won. The months that followed were filled with preparation. Wade converted one of the smaller rooms in their house into a nursery, painting the walls a soft cream color and building a crib with his own hands from reclaimed wood from the old barn. The same barn where they'd first kissed all those years ago. Caroline worked alongside him for as long as her body allowed, refusing to be treated like fragile porcelain. She rode out to check the cattle until her 6th month, when Wade finally convinced her it was time to slow down. Not because she couldn't, but because their child deserved a mother who took care of herself. Richard came by more often now. At first, his visits were awkward, stilted conversations about weather and cattle prices. But gradually, something shifted. He'd sit on their porch, watching Caroline's belly grow, and sometimes his eyes would fill with tears. "I almost missed this," he said one evening, voice thick with emotion. "I almost lost you completely because I was too stubborn to see what really mattered." Caroline reached over and squeezed his hand. "But you didn't miss it, Dad. You're here now. And that's what counts." The baby came on a crisp October morning, just as the first autumn colors were touching the trees. Caroline's water broke while she was making breakfast, and Wade, who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind, suddenly forgot everything he'd planned. "The bag! Where's the bag?" he shouted, running through the house. "Kitchen table," Caroline said calmly, though her grip on the counter betrayed her own nervousness. "Wade, breathe." "I am breathing," he said, not breathing at all. Despite the chaos of those first moments, they made it to the hospital with time to spare. The labor was long, 14 hours that felt like 14 years to Wade, who held Caroline's hand through every contraction, whispering encouragements and apologies in equal measure. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry you have to go through this." "Wade," she managed between contractions. "Shut up and let me concentrate." He did, pressing kisses to her forehead instead, his own face wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. When their daughter finally entered the world at 3:47 in the afternoon, her cry was strong and indignant, as if offended by the sudden cold air. The nurse placed her on Caroline's chest, and the world stopped. She was perfect. Tiny fingers that immediately grasped Caroline's thumb, a shock of dark hair, eyes that would eventually settle into Wade's deep brown. Grace, Caroline whispered, the name they'd chosen together. Grace Elizabeth Mercer. Wade leaned down, his arms encompassing both of them, his face buried against Caroline's shoulder as he wept openly. All the years of pain, of separation, of fighting, it all led to this moment. This perfect, impossible moment. Richard met his granddaughter that evening. He stood in the doorway of the hospital room for a long moment, just watching, before Caroline beckoned him in. "Dad, come meet Grace." His hands trembled as he approached the bed. When Caroline carefully placed the baby in his arms, his face crumbled. "She's beautiful," he choked out. "Come, she's absolutely beautiful." "She has your nose," Wade said softly. And it wasn't an accusation or a joke, just a simple truth offered as a peace offering. Richard looked up at him, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for not giving up on her, for being the man I should have been." Wade shook his head. "We're all doing our best, sir. That's all any of us can do." Little Grace slept through the entire exchange, her small chest rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of innocence. She knew nothing of the battles fought before her birth, nothing of the prejudice and pride that had tried to keep her parents apart. She was simply loved, completely and unconditionally, by everyone in that room. The first months with a newborn were exhausting in ways neither Caroline nor Wade had fully anticipated. The sleepless nights, the constant feedings, the mysterious crying that seemed to have no cause or cure. But they faced it together, taking turns walking the floor with Grace, singing off-key lullabies, and collapsing into bed whenever she finally slept. The ranch adjusted to the newest member of the family. Employees would stop by with hand-carved toys and knitted blankets. Richard became a fixture at their house, arriving each morning to hold his granddaughter, while Caroline and Wade handled the early morning chores. "I miss this with you," he told Caroline one morning, Grace asleep in his arms. "I was always so focused on the ranch, on building the legacy, that I forgot to just be your father." "You're here now," Caroline said, kissing his cheek. "That's what matters." As Grace grew, the ranch thrived. The unified property was more prosperous than either section had been alone. Wade's innovative approaches combined with the Thornfield legacy created something entirely new, a model that other ranchers in the region began to emulate. But more than the financial success, it was the healing that mattered most. The fence that had once divided the properties was gone, its posts pulled up, the wire rolled away. In its place, they planted a row of oak trees, one for each year they'd been apart. "So our daughter never forgets," Wade said as they stood back to admire their work, Grace babbling happily in the carrier on Caroline's chest. So she knows that what tries to separate us can become what unites us if we're willing to transform it. On Grace's first birthday, they held a celebration that brought together everyone who'd been part of their journey. Ranch hands and wealthy landowners mingled freely, sharing food and stories. Richard gave a toast, his voice steady despite his emotion. "A year ago, my granddaughter came into this world, and with her came a reminder of what I'd almost destroyed through my own stubbornness and pride." He looked at Caroline and Wade, his eyes bright. These two young people taught an old man that love isn't about control. It's about trust, about believing that the people we love are strong enough to make their own choices, even when those choices scare us. He raised his glass higher. To Grace, and to the family that refused to give up on each other. The toast was echoed by everyone present, glasses raised high as the sun set over the unified ranch, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. That night, after all the guests had left, and Grace was asleep in her crib. Caroline and Wade sat on their porch, the same porch where so much had been said and unsaid over the years. "Dad, do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Caroline asked, leaning against Wade's shoulder. "Every day," he admitted. "But I don't regret any of it, not even the pain, because it made us who we are. It made us appreciate this." He gestured to the darkened ranch, to the house behind them where their daughter slept, to the life they'd built from the ashes of what had been destroyed. "My father used to say that the land always remembers," Wade continued, "that everything that happens on it, the good and the bad, becomes part of its story. I didn't understand that when I was young, but I do now." Caroline turned to look at him, his profile highlighted by the porch light. "What do you think this land will remember about us?" Wade smiled, pulling her closer. "That love is stubborn. That it doesn't give up, even when everything and everyone says it should. That it can be beaten down, driven away, buried deep, but if it's real, it always finds a way back." Inside, Grace began to cry. Not the distressed cry of hunger or pain, but the half-hearted whimper of a baby who'd woken up and wanted reassurance that her parents were near. Caroline stood to go to her, but Wade caught her hand. "I'll get her," he said. "You rest." But Caroline followed anyway, because that's what they did, faced everything together. They stood on either side of the crib, watching as Grace's eyes found them, and her crying stopped, replaced by a gummy smile. "She knows," Caroline whispered. "She knows she's loved." "The way every child should know," Wade agreed, reaching down to stroke his daughter's soft hair. "And the way I'll make sure she always knows." The years that followed brought more children. A son they named James, after Wade's father, and another daughter, Claire. The house that had once been too quiet now rang with laughter and the thunder of small feet on wooden floors. Richard lived to see all 3 of his grandchildren, though his health continued to decline. In his final days, surrounded by family, he held Caroline's hand and whispered, "I'm proud of you. I should have said it more, but I'm saying it now. You saved us all." After his passing, Caroline found letters he'd written to each of the children, to be given to them when they were older. In Grace's letter, he wrote, "My dear Grace, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand that sometimes good people make terrible mistakes. I made many, but your parents' love was stronger than my prejudice, stronger than my pride, stronger than everything I did to try to stop it. Remember that, sweet girl. Remember that love, real love, is the most powerful force in this world, and you were born from a love that refused to die." The Thornfield Mercer Ranch, as it came to be known, became more than just a successful business. It became a symbol in the region, proof that old wounds could heal, that forgiveness was possible, that love could bridge any divide. Wade taught his children to work the land with the same dedication his father had taught him, but without the shame of being less than anyone else. Caroline taught them the business side, but also the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their position. And Grace, James, and Claire grew up never knowing what it was like to be told their love was wrong, their dreams impossible, their worth determined by their last name or their bank account. They grew up free, free to love whom they chose, free to build the lives they wanted, free to make mistakes and learn from them. On what would have been Richard's 80th birthday, the family gathered at the oak trees that marked the old property line. The trees had grown tall and strong, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural canopy. Grace, now 7 years old, asked, "Mama, why did we plant these trees here?" Caroline knelt beside her daughter, Wade's hand warm on her shoulder. "Because sometimes, the places where we struggled the most become the places where we grow the strongest. These trees mark where your father and I weren't allowed to be together. But look at them now. Look at how beautiful they've become." Like you and Daddy, Grace said with the simple wisdom of a child. Yes, Caroline smiled, tears in her eyes. Exactly like me and Daddy. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch, their home, their legacy, Caroline and Wade stood together where the fence had once been. 3 decades had passed since that first kiss in the barn, since the expulsion and the separation, since all the pain that had tried to break them. We made it, Caroline said softly. We made it, Wade agreed, pulling her close. And the land, which had witnessed everything, the forbidden love, the heartbreak, the reunion, the forgiveness, the healing, seemed to settle around them with a sigh of contentment, because this was what it had been waiting for all along. Not perfection, but persistence. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of love that was strong enough to overcome it. In the distance, their children's laughter rang out as they chased fireflies in the twilight. The lights from the house glowed warm and welcoming. And somewhere in the evening breeze, carried on the scent of earth and growing things, was the promise that this land would remember their story, not as a tragedy that almost was, but as a love story that refused to end. A love that became root and harvest, soil and seed, sunset and sunrise. A love that, against all odds, had finally come home. If this story touched your heart, comment where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that force us to fight for them. And in the fighting, we discover who we really are. True love doesn't give up. It transforms everything it touches. And that transformation becomes the legacy we leave behind.